lost my pen.
You can borrow mine.
Thanks.
I lost something once. I lost something I couldn't live without. My identity.
So anyway, thanks for the pen.
No problem.
Generation 1 of Pokemon versus Generation 9 are two completely different worlds. Sure, they're both Pokemon, technically, but Gen 1 is so, I guess, unique, you could say, that it might as well be like comparing Pokemon to Digimon. While Generation 1 was certainly a fun generation and has a strong fan base, the general consensus is, dear God, thank the Lord Pokemon did not stay like in Gen 1. But what if it didn't? What if Pokemon still worked like in Gen 1? Now, there's lots of ways you can interpret this statement, but for simplicity's sake, we're going to analyze Gen 9 and putting a Gen 1 filter on it to see how much it would change. Rules. We will basically be applying the same mechanics of Gen 1 to Gen 9, but we will still be conserving the new moves of pre-existing types. So for example, moves like Draco Meteor, U-Turn will still exist, but we will be pretending the Dark, Fairy, and Steel types don't, because they didn't exist back in Gen 1, obviously. So first off, mechanical differences. There are a lot of mechanical differences in Gen 1, but I'm going to go ahead and just clear up some of the most major ones between Gen 1 and Gen 9. So there's a lot. We're going to be doing it rapid fire style. Number 1, the special stat. As you might already know, the special attack and special defense stat were combined into one stat called the special stat. This means Pokemon like Chansey were mostly tanky Pokemon, capable of actually dishing out a lot more damage than they are now. Number 2, critical hits. Critical hits were dictated by speed. So, for example, Gen 1, the Pokemon with the highest speed stat no U, Jolteon, had a crit rate of 25.39. Number 3, freezes. Freezes could only be unthawed via fire-type moves and if the opponent used haste, which they never did. So essentially, if you're frozen, it is a death sentence. That is why freeze is the most OP status condition. Speaking of OP, let's talk about trapping moves. Moves like Wrap, Fire Spin, and Gen 1 not only prevent you from switching out, but also from straight up moving. So they are super OP. It's one of the main reasons people use Pokemon like Cloyster. On top of that, there are obviously no items, no abilities, no Dark, Steel, or Fairy types. You could also max out stat, which made Pokemon a lot bulkier, and there's no physical special split. So now onto the fun stuff. How would this affect the Gen 9 OU tier? So first things first, the Pokemon. No Dark, Steel, or Fairy type Pokemon / moves would exist. That means that Pokemon like Kingambit, Corviknight, Darkrai, Enamorus, Golden Goat, Hatterene, Iron Crown, Iron Valiant, Primarina, Samurott, Hisuian, Tinglu, Tinkaton, Weavile, and Clefable would all just cease to exist from the OU tier, or for Pokemon like Clefable, for example, would have to revert back to the original typing of normal. This new or old type chart could be a good thing. Maybe. Let's analyze that. So Gen 1's type chart was notorious for a few things. Number 1 was the overpoweredness of the Psychic and Normal types. Anyone who has watched at least one Big Yellow video would know that the reason the Psychic type was OP sort of boiled down to the lack of viable Bug and Ghost type moves in Pokemon. The reason Normal types were so good was the lack of Fighting type moves and resistances. However, now in Gen 9, we have a lot more Bug and Ghost type Pokemon and moves, so they wouldn't be as good. Same goes for the Normal type. Even if the Steel type doesn't exist, we still have an abundance of Ghost and Fighting types available to make things hard for them. Property-wise, the Psychic type would have one less weakness. That's good, but honestly, it's really nothing special offensively or defensively. Same for the Normal type. Overall, I feel like the way we view types now would translate mostly to the same. Essentially, types that are absolutely buns, like Bug, and you guessed it, the Psychic type, would still be bad. They would be still poor excuses for Digimons. And Pokemon with the types of Water and Ground, which are generally seen as great, would still be great.
Here comes the boy, hello boy, welcome, there he is.
Now let's talk about the current OU Pokemon that because of these changes would probably suck or at least dwindle a little bit in the usage rates or viability. First things first, the lack of items. The lack of items and ability make for far more offensive metagame. I know that seems kind of weird because, for example, let's take abilities like Reckless or Sheer Force. If they don't exist, they make the game less offensively oriented. I understand this is kind of a controversial thing to say, but I think that abilities matter a lot more for defensive Pokemon than for offensive Pokemon. Take a Pokemon like Darkrai. Because Sleep is banned, he essentially has no abilities in the modern Gen 9 OU tier. However, Pokemon like Dondozo or Lomolola would really have a hard time if they didn't have access to their defensive abilities. Dondozo or Lomolola would not be able to be OU tier Pokemon without Unaware and Regenerator. This is a reflection by the fact that Pokemon like Chansey, which is almost exclusively a Stallmon, was not a Stallmon In Gen 1, it was more of a tank. In fact, if you go to my history of stall video, I pretty honestly say that stall just didn't exist in Gen 1. Something else that would make it harder for stall mons is the lack of physical special split. But physical special split was overall a positive change offensively, because it meant that Pokemon with stab types in the opposite ends of the spectrum could finally use both of their stab moves effectively, like Breloom. But that was only a problem because Natures existed in Gen 3. Let me explain. The lack of physical special split made life hard for stall mons. In my history of stall video, I mentioned Gen 4 was the first gen where stall was actually viable strategy. It's no coincidence that the generation that introduced the physical special split was also the generation that my dearly beloved stall Pokemon finally got a chance to shine altogether.
I hate you, you stupid hippo. I hate you and I want you to die. Fred Paragus. Excuse me, my French. Paralysis!
In my opinion, the reason that mixed attackers were far less common was because they didn't have to pick and choose their natures. Stall Pokemon's worst nightmare is a mixed attacker. It's one of the reasons stall isn't really a thing in VGC, because sure, Skarmory can wall most physical attackers, but it can't do anything against its teammate using Fire Blast. So the Pokemon I feel wouldn't cut anymore are Alomalola, Dondozo, and Moltres because they pretty much hold only defensive value, unlike other Pokemon that may be bulky, but also had a lot of offensive value like Landorus. You might be wondering why so few Pokemon would fall from the OU tier. I think it just comes down to the fact that Gen 9 is pretty hyper offense oriented. The reason I think Moltres wouldn't be OU is because assuming Stealth Rocks would exist, this would be a big challenge for Moltres, because items don't exist, therefore heavy duty boots don't exist. In general, flying types would have a lot of a harder time because they wouldn't have access to heavy duty boots. So that leads me to the Pokemon that aren't OU, but could be with this Gen 1 filter, or would at least have a glow up. Number 1, Hisuian Zoroark. A while ago I did a video called Pokemon Introduced in the Wrong Gen, where you guessed it, I talk about Pokemon that would have had more success if they were introduced in a previous gen. Part of the reason Hisuian Zoroark would have been successful is because 1, it would have no weaknesses, ergo the lack of dark typing, alongside 3 immunities. But also remember the special stats and special defense stat are 1, meaning its special defense could be a lot more impressive. It would have a 125 special stat. Not only that, but crits are based on speed, and with its 110 base speed, it would have a crit rate of 21.48%, same as Tauros, the best Gen 1 Pokemon. Next is Deoxys Speed. Deoxys Speed has a reputation for being the second worst Deoxys form, right behind Deoxys Defense. But there's one thing that definitely stands out, obviously its speed stat. We already went over how crit rate is dictated by speed. I was curious to see what Deoxys' speed crit rate would be. Now, the formula that we obtained for finding out the crit rate of RBY is pretty easy. It's X times 100 divided by 522. Since Deoxys' speed stat is 180, that means its crit rate would be huge at 35.15%. Not only that, but since you can max out stats, it would be stronger and a lot bulkier. Now, that's not all either. I mentioned how trapping moves were absolutely OP, because once you used one, your opponent would literally not be able to move if you don't outspeed while you're out of luck. And guess what? Deoxys has access to Wrap with its 180 base speed stat. Unless your name is Regieleki or you're a ghost type, you're gonna be a victim. While we're on the topic of trappers, Infernape would also be a much better Pokemon for similar reasons to Deoxys Speed, with a speed stat of 108. It would have a perfectly acceptable crit rate of 21.09%. But also, because of the lack of split and lack of natures and max out stats, it's a perfect environment for a mixed attacker, especially frail ones. It lets them run whatever they want without having to pick and choose natures. It would be free to run moves like Fire Blast to Mach Punch in close combat without having to sacrifice that would lessen its special attack or physical attack stat, or an ability that would generally make it frailer. Just like Deoxys, he also has access to trapping moves like Fire Spin, and with 108 base speed, he'd be a great trapping Pokemon and at the same time can dish out powerful mix attacks. Now, I'd like to talk about a Pokemon that would be restored to its former glory, Blissey. First off, why not Chansey? Well, remember, no items, so Chansey does not get access to Eviolite. But to explain why Blissey would have been more good than it is now, I'll use Chansey to explain since they're still extremely similar. Chansey was already an amazing Gen 1 Pokemon because of the special stat. Remember, it was not only super bulky, but also had an impressive special attack stat for that time. And because you could max out stats, it wasn't able to be easily OHKO'd even by physical attacks. Blissey is essentially the same thing, but with better stats. One of the reasons the 2 pink blobs aren't as good this gen is because it's a much more offensively oriented gen, and they don't have access to Toxic anymore. But because Gen 1 mechanics, it would be much more offensively oriented anyways, matching the Gen 9 metagame. And in Gen 1, Chansey doesn't even use Toxic. Most Chansey sets in RBY are, again, just offensively oriented. Now, first off, Tauros. Tauros has an essentially 100% usage rate. He's the best revenge killer of Gen 1. He's a Pokemon with a good speed tier and a good special stat, but he was mainly good because he benefited from the fact that 1. Not many Pokemon were faster, 2. There weren't any ghost types to ignore his stab, Hyper Beams, Double Legends, and Body Slams, and 3. Fighting types just non-existent. However, that's not the case anymore. Pokemon like Great Tusk, Dragapult, and Zamazenta, just to name a few, would cause a huge problem for him. Maybe he would be ZU material just like he is now. He definitely would not be OU anyways. Next is Snorlax. Snorlax is in a very similar situation to Tauros. To make it short, it's a Pokemon that benefited a lot from the lack of immunities and fighting types. Now it has to watch out for them. It would be a nothing burger for Pokemon. Not only that, it would be a nothing burger Pokemon with an outdated move pool. It would be a bit better if it had reliable recovery like Slack Off, but the only thing it has is Rest, which is not great. The next is Chansey. We already talked about why Blissey would be great, and honestly the same thing goes for Chansey. It would be just as good, but Blissey would definitely be the Pokemon that gets the best out of all the Gen 1 Titans. Next is Starmie. I feel like Starmie would be the Pokemon that aged the second best. That's not saying a lot, however, but Starmie has a few things going for it. Access to Rapid Spin, access to Recover, and an impressive speed tier, including a crit rate of 22.46. All of this means I feel like Starmie wouldn't be OU material, no, but at the very least NU. Overall, I won't bore you, pretty much all of the good Gen 1 Pokemon would be bad. Sure, the mechanics that would make them great are still there, but the addition of new Pokemon, new moves, and just power creep in general would be way too much for them. So the main question becomes, would this be a positive thing? I've spent a good amount of hours scripting this and thinking of how to interpret this question. I know there were a multitude ways to approach it, but I also think that what I landed on was best. Although I think that it would have made for an interesting metagame, I think that it would have been a very unbalanced one. We can just look at Gen 1 if we need proof of that. I love that game, but there's a reason it's not the most popular tier to play. The addition of natures, the split, dark, fairy, and steel typings, abilities, and health items gave the game so much more diversity that it desperately needed. Overall, Gen 1 was cool, but Gen 1 should stay in Gen 1.